On April 15th, 1912, almost 1,500 people lost their lives on Titanic, and immediately, people wanted to know why, and they began asking questions. It didn't take long for the speculations to start to drift into the supernatural, and people wondered if maybe there was something more going on behind the curtain, or if maybe somebody predicted Titanic before it ever set sail. Which leads us to the question that we're going to try to answer today. Did anyone predict Titanic? Or are we maybe assigning meaning to events after they happened now that we already know how they end? Let's examine some of the strange premonitions associated with Titanic, starting with fireman John Coffey. Did this fireman desert Titanic because he had a strange feeling, or is there something else going on? First, let's set the scene and let me tell you the story. At just 23 years old, John Coffey was already familiar with White Star Line vessels, having worked on Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. He signed on for the maiden voyage of Titanic on April 6, 1912, and then continued on through the maiden voyage in Southampton, going through her port of calls. However, he made a peculiar decision. Instead of settling in and getting ready with the routine with everyone else, John Coffey decided to desert the ship at the last port of call, Queenstown, now Cove, Ireland. In the days that followed the sinking, John Coffey became known as one of the luckiest men in the world, and as time passed, so did the story. Later in life in interviews, John said he had a strange foreboding about the ship, and that's what prompted him to flee in the first place. This is an attention-grabbing story, so naturally people ran with it, and honestly, I don't blame them. Who doesn't want to believe that somebody escaped Titanic because they saw the future? But what if these feelings were assigned to the disaster post-mortem? Excuse the pun. There's a couple reasons to think that maybe John Coffey had other reasons for deserting Titanic other than a sense of foreboding. Hear me out. John Coffey was an Irish-born man of Queenstown, but his last listed address of residence was in Southampton, England. I assume because it'd be easier to find work during a worker strike that was going on there. However, his mother still resided in his place of birth at Queenstown. So is it possible that maybe John was planning to desert the ship from the start to visit his mother? And Titanic just so happened to be the first ship that happened to be taking passage. It gives a new name to the luck of the Irish either way, but I think this feels like a more practical and logical reason than seeing the future. Now, I get it. The story of I deserted the ship because I wanted to see my mom is not as compelling as I left the ship because I knew something bad was going to happen. It wouldn't have looked too good for John Coffey if he admitted outright that he was abandoning his post to go visit family, especially considering he still went on to work in sea life. He actually signed on to a ship the very next week after Titanic. But I think there's a reason that stories like this are so enduring. Because if John knew something, if there were warning signs, maybe that makes Titanic not as random as it feels. We want to believe that somewhere, somehow, someone knew what was going to happen. And that maybe if we listen to our intuition in the same way that John Coffey did, that we can avoid events like Titanic just like he did. And I think that's one of the many reasons people talk about premonitions like this more than a century later, but I might be getting ahead of myself. John Coffey certainly wasn't the only one who had a sinking feeling about Titanic. Our next premonition has a little bit more evidence for us to come to a determination. And if you weren't swayed by the foreboding of John Coffey, maybe you'll be swayed by the interviews of Eva Hart. Eva Hart spoke about Titanic for decades and was one of the most outspoken survivors well into her 80s, doing speeches, interviews, and attending Titanic events. And what's interesting about hearing her interviews over time is that psychologists now understand something very interesting about the way memory is stored. Over time, we don't store memories like a video recording or a file in a filing cabinet. They're changeable, malleable, and they do change over time. Titanic was one of the worst nights of Eva's life. She was only 7 years old. She lost her father in the disaster and suffered from nightmares for years afterwards. She was terrified of future voyages by ships, and it would be years before she had the courage to speak about her experiences on Titanic. In her public accounts, Eva maintained that her mother Esther had a terrible feeling about Titanic from the start, and that she had even begged Benjamin, Eva's father, not to travel. But he was insistent and excited to start a new life in America after falling on hard times with their business ventures. While on board, Eva reported that her mother would stay awake all night, fully dressed and prepared for something to happen, and that when she slept, it was only during the day. This preparedness came in handy when it was time for them to evacuate onto the lifeboats, and her mother was able to save her and little Eva, but her father Ben was lost. Now, if you're familiar in the Titanic world, you'll know that Eva Hart's interviews have been criticized for accuracy for a couple of reasons, and I would like to touch on the background and paint a little bit different picture. For starters, Eva was only 7 years old when this happened to her. 7! And she didn't speak about the event until many years later. In her interviews, Eva's recollections differ over time, and there is a lot of emphasis placed on the foreboding feeling that her mother had. And some have criticized the premonitions and what Eva said as being different than the reality of what actually happened. But here's the thing, I don't think Eva's lying, and I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Modern psychologists have a term associated with shocking and emotionally charged events. They're called flashbulb memories. The idea behind a flashbulb memory is that some moments in our lives become so emotionally charged that we remember exactly where we were, what we felt, and what happened to us. Think about September 11th, or the Titan implosion. Most people can remember exactly where they were when they heard that news. Some people can go as far as to remember what they were wearing or what music was playing in the background. And these memories are often so vivid that they're frozen in our minds, like a flashbulb, if you will. As a way to study flashbulb memories, scientists interviewed college students within 24 hours of a shocking event, like 9/11, the space shuttle explosion, even the assassination of JFK and Martin Luther King. They asked them to write down how they found out, where they were, what they were wearing, etc., etc. And then, over a period of months, sometimes years later, they went back and asked those same questions and then analyzed those participants' memories to see if anything had changed over time. What they found might surprise you. Many people remembered the events they were interviewed about differently. Some details changed dramatically and others didn't, but overall, most participants' memories changed and were different than what they had originally written down. Recollections were more accurate the sooner they were recorded versus coming back and asking about them later. And yet, here's the really interesting part. Even though these memories had shifted, and even when participants were shown their original answers versus the answers that they had given, all of their confidence remained very high that their altered memories were the correct ones. And here's the thing, these people weren't lying. These are participants who were acting in good faith. Like I said, memory isn't like a video recording or a file in a filing cabinet that stays the same every time we recollect it. It's called memory reconsolidation. And basically that just means every time that we're remembering something, that we're changing it just a little bit every time we remember it. But here's the thing, it's all happening subconsciously, and we truly believe in the memories that we have at the time that we're interviewed. At least, that's what most of the participants in these studies did. And of course, memories associated with trauma can be especially powerful and especially emotionally charged. Eva Hart was deeply affected by Titanic, and she lost her dad, and it took years before she spoke about it in public. That's 80 years of remembering and 80 years of retelling one of the worst nights in your life. And while Eva Hart remained exceptionally consistent in most of her interviews, there are certain points where her recollections start to differ. And that's human. It does not mean she was lying. It means that she was having a human memory and going through the very phenomena of how memory is stored. Eva was human and doing the best that she could with the memories that she formed at 7 years old and the information she learned over a lifetime of reading about Titanic and learning about a national tragedy. That said, I don't know if Esther Hart truly sensed danger and stayed up every single night. I don't know if Eva's memories of her mother perfectly reflected reality, but I don't think that's the most interesting part of this story anyways. Because whether it was John Coffey leaving the ship at the last port of call or Eva Hart remembering the foreboding sense that her mother had when she was 7 years old, these stories all point to a very similar and uncomfortable idea, that people desperately want tragedies to have warnings and meaning. We want disasters to have signs. We want to believe that somewhere, somehow, someone knew what was going to happen. And if we had just paid a closer attention like John Coffey or Esther Hart did, that maybe we could avoid the randomness that comes from being involved in a tragedy like Titanic or the space shuttle explosion or 9/11. Because if all those events were truly random and unpredictable, that's terrifying. Okay. But what if the fear surrounded Titanic happened long before 1912? What if someone had a sense that something was going to go wrong many years before Titanic was even built? Our next story doesn't come from a survivor or someone who sailed on Titanic at all. He was a writer. And depending on who you asked, he might have predicted the sinking of Titanic 14 years before it happened. In 1898, author Morgan Robertson wrote a tale with eerily similar details to the sinking of Titanic. Let's go over some of them, and you tell me if these sound familiar. In the original book, titled Futility, the largest passenger liner afloat, called the SS Titan, is sailing through a cold April at night in the Atlantic Ocean when she strikes an iceberg and begins to capsize. She's only carrying 24 lifeboats, the regulation minimum, and because of that, there's a heavy loss of life that could have been prevented. As an added bonus, the SS Titan was also marketed as unsinkable. the unsinkable Titan. But who is this Morgan Robertson, and where did his apparent precognition come from? Let's dive in a little deeper and see if we can figure it out. Morgan was 37 when he wrote Futility, and he had already lived an eventful life. For over a decade, he worked at sea, working his way up and becoming a first mate. Though he grew tired of that line of work, he moved on to be a jewelry salesman and jewelry maker. But all the while, he had an underlying passion that he carried with him: storytelling. Having an interest and knowledge base in the sea, Morgan Robertson used his maritime knowledge to write several stories about the sea that also included deadly maritime accidents. At the time, it was common knowledge that ships were growing faster and bigger than they ever had before. To keep up with competition, it seemed like there was a newest, largest, best, fastest ship every other month. And believe it or not, there were many people who were watching this and criticized just how quickly these ships were growing and if regulations were able to keep up at that speed. Spoiler alert, they were not keeping up. Many people, especially knowledgeable ship people like Morgan Robertson, would have seen this and been able to take that as inspiration for the stories that he was writing. Morgan Robertson himself denounced the claims that he was some kind of psychic and instead said that he just knew what he was talking about. And indeed he did. With all the experience that he had at sea, he was able to look at what was happening and make predictions about what would happen if regulations did not keep up with the current climate. This was such a common critique that what if I told you Morgan Robertson was not the only person to write about a ship similar to Titanic? In fact, this next gentleman not only wrote a story eerily similar to Titanic, but he ended up dying on Titanic over 20 years after he wrote the story. William Thomas Stead is known as one of the founding fathers of investigative journalism, and he's a cool guy, let me tell you. His passion lied in advocating for change and using his words for humanitarian causes. One such issue that caught his attention was the lack of lifeboats on these ever-growing ships. He wrote a fictional short story more than a decade before Morgan Robertson wrote Futility. He titled it How the Mail Ship Went Down in the Mid-Atlantic, which documents a very familiar tale of a large passenger liner colliding with another ship and a great heavy loss of life due to lack of lifeboats. He ended his story by saying this, and I just think this is so powerful. This is exactly what might take place and will take place if liners are sent to sea short of boats. Then, 26 years later in 1912, William Thomas Stead boards Titanic as a first-class passenger, ultimately losing his life over the very same thing he had written about 2 decades prior. Titanic didn't invent the fears that we had, but she did confirm them. It took 1,500 people losing their life for the world to make the changes to maritime regulations that people had been talking about for decades prior. It's often said that the regulations that we have today are written in blood, and I think Titanic is a perfect example of that. But was it supernatural premonition, or was it human nature that saw the cracks in the system long before the system did anything to change it? Did anyone predict Titanic? Well, maybe. It depends on who you ask. John Coffey said he had a bad feeling and left the ship before it left for the Atlantic. Ava Hart talked about the premonitions that her mother had all the while they were on board Titanic. Morgan Robertson and William Thomas Stead imagined a disaster that looked remarkably similar to Titanic years before it happened. These stories are often grouped together as warnings or premonitions or prophecies of some kind. Proof that somebody, somewhere, knew what was coming. But after researching them, I don't think that's what makes these stories interesting. These stories are phenomenally interesting if you take the supernatural element out of them. John Coffey very well may have been the luckiest man alive. Eva Hart spent 80 years trying to understand and come to terms with the worst night of her life when she lost her father at 7 years old. And Morgan Robertson may have just been an experienced sailor paying attention to maritime trends and pointing out the flaws in the system that no one had addressed yet. Maybe the question isn't whether anyone predicted Titanic, but why so many people had fears about something like Titanic happening in the first place. Because Titanic didn't emerge from nowhere. She was built during an age of incredible technological optimism. Ships were getting bigger, faster, more luxurious. And many people believed progress itself would solve every problem, and the worst was in the past. But others looked at the same world and saw warning signs. Not necessarily supernatural warning signs, but signs that regulations and things needed to change along with the advancement of technology. When Titanic sank, people looked back and wondered if X, Y, or Z had happened, that maybe the whole disaster could have been avoided in the first place. And that's the real tragedy, is that it probably could have been. Maybe we like to have supernatural explanations for things because randomness truly is terrifying. Because if tragedy can strike without warning, then the world truly feels unpredictable, a little less controllable and a little less safe. So it's comforting to search for clues. The bad feelings, the warnings, the things that could have saved us if we only just listened. More than a century later, we're still doing it. And maybe that's one of many reasons Titanic remains so fascinating. Not because people predicted disaster, but because disaster revealed the fears that people had all along. Thank you if you made it this far, and if you have any questions or any other stories you want to talk about, leave them in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.